Robin Burton from the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies.
I'm working with the beneficiary division of the Red Cross. And the main thing about the beneficiary communications is that we believe communication should be two-way. In many ways, we think of our beneficiaries in the same way as the commercial world tends to think of its customers, except with one difference, is that they're customers that don't have the power of choice. And we've been working in particular to put together a range of different methodologies for communicating with people. And one of these is the TERA SMS system. And as I say, this is just one element in a complete communication strategy. I wouldn't for one moment suggest that this is the only sort of thing that you ought to do. But what it is, it's a location-targeted system. So this means we can decide to send messages to people in just one particular area. So it's narrow casting, if you like. We're not blasting the entire country. We can also operate keyword-driven responses. So this means, for example, if you had a campaign about cholera, the system will look for a variety of keywords coming in on SMS and can respond with pre-prepared messages. So if people ask about different things, they'll get a different response automatically. And those messages obviously can then be collated so that we know what people are talking about, what they're interested in. It can also be used in response to questions that we might pose to people, such as how useful did you find that hygiene kit, for example, that kind of thing. Now this has been deployed in Haiti now for 2 years. And we've delivered more than 100 million messages so far using this system in Haiti, and had 1 million replies, which we think is pretty significant. But the key thing about it is that 95% of people in our surveys afterwards said that they really appreciated getting these messages from us. And even more important, 90% said that they changed their behavior as a direct result. There's a number of reasons for this. Partly it's because it acts as a reinforcement to some of the other media that we're using, things like radio, for example. And also it's retained on the phone. So we can send people a series of messages and they can look back at what those messages were. So they can remind themselves about the various bits of information we've been sending to them. It also means that they can run and tell other people. So people who perhaps don't have a mobile phone can still receive this information. We developed this system quite crucially in conjunction with the local mobile operator, an operator called Voila. It's part of the Trilogy International group, and it was designed directly in response to the Haiti earthquake. I mention all this as a bit of a precursor because what I'm talking about here is the whole issue of how do you work with mobile phone companies. It's a good idea to understand them a little bit, so let's talk about the mobile industry. Today in the world, there's more than 4 billion mobile phones in use. This means, in reality, that just about everybody who can afford one has got one. Even in some of the poorest countries, you'll find very high levels of penetration. And as an industry, it really does dwarf things like the whole entertainment industry. If you took TV, cinema, radio, recorded music, the whole of that industry could fit several times over into the mobile industry. So it is massive. But it is an industry in maturity. For about 20 years or so, running a mobile network was a license to print money, quite frankly, because you had very high rates of growth. The whole industry was used to double-digit rates of growth, sometimes as high as 20 or 30% for quite some considerable period. And they got very used to that. But now, there isn't so much opportunity for growth. As we've said, nearly everybody who wants one has got one, so where do you look for growth? In fact, I'd be willing to bet that most of you have seen your mobile phone bills go down consistently year on year for the last few years. The reason for that has been there's been a great level of competition. They haven't been very clever about how they compete with each other. They've tended to compete on price or brand. And as a result, the price has been driven way down. And the revenues are declining. For some years, they all thought that mobile data was going to be the savior of their revenues. That because we were all going to be using iPhones and smartphones, somehow there was going to be a huge amount of money for them to be made, to make. Well, they're right. There is a huge amount of money to be made, but it's being made by Apple, not by the mobile phone companies. So they're still continuing on the downward spiral. And it's so bad that, in fact, next year, many European operators expect to see negative cash flow. So in other words, they will be losing money on a month-by-month basis. If you ever thought that the mobile industry was, an uninhibited pit of money that, could give you whatever you wanted at any time and not worry about it, I'm afraid it's not quite like that. Not anymore, anyway. They're worried about their own survival as much as anything else. And let's think now about what happens in a disaster. This is a photograph I took a couple of weeks ago in Kathmandu, where we're expecting a large earthquake at some point in the next few years. And one of the things you immediately notice is that most of the towers, most of the cell sites, the antenna, are located on the top of very vulnerable looking buildings. So we will expect that towers will be damaged. This will result in the loess of capacity on the mobile network. There will also be a peak in demand because everybody wants to know what's happened to their family members, quite naturally. They will be calling each other, and the network will get jammed. Now, talking with operators, many operators in disaster vulnerable areas are thinking about this. What should they do in order to protect themselves? So they do look at protecting their sites where they can. That means with alternative power and various things like that. They also have plans in place to limit usage in the event of a disaster, such as restricting phone calls to maybe 30 seconds. Hello, I'm fine, and that's it. And encouraging people to use SMS text rather than to make calls or to try and use data. They're also looking in some cases to provide, and this is certainly the case in Nepal, is to provide a basic alternative network. One of the good things about the good old-fashioned basic 2G coverage is that it can provide quite a wide area of coverage with a relatively small number of cell sites. So they plan in Kathmandu to put a ring of these 2G sites around the valley, which will be enough to provide a limited amount of capacity. And this will be on a different frequency. You'll need a separate SIM card to run with it, a dual SIM, so that if the regular network is up, you'll be able to use the regular network. If not, if you have one of these dual SIMs, you can use the emergency network. A little bit of insight into how do they see aid agencies. Well, one of the first questions is who can they trust? In Haiti, following the earthquake there was quite a number of organizations approached the network operators. And talking with the people at Voila, they certainly had a queue forming outside their door of people that wanted help. And not all of them were bona fide. In fact, at least one group actually sent messages telling survivors that they needed to pay money in order to receive Red Cross aid, for example. And there were others who presented themselves as aid agencies and used it to send spam on, all the usual things that you receive mobile spam for. So they're also worrying about, even if they're bona fide, will they damage my business? So are they going to be disciplined in the way that they send messages? Or is it going to be, a bit of a nightmare for me? Might they send messages which might damage my business? Will they respect my information, my intellectual property? The other thing is, they're going to say, actually, I'm quite busy right now. I'm rebuilding towers and trying to get the network back online. And I probably don't have time to talk to you at this moment. Thanks very much. And they also might think that usage by aid agencies is just going to make matters worse, because they're already struggling with an overloaded network. And here we are saying we want to put more communication out there. Principles for cooperation. And I know in the CDAC group, there's been a lot of talk about principles for collaboration. To show that you respect their business. They're here to make money for their shareholders, not to be there to help us. Also, try and get your systems implemented ahead of time. Because if you're doing it immediately after a disaster, the chances are no one's going to have time to talk to you. You need to demonstrate that you've put in place safeguards to protect their business, their operation systems from what you're going to do. And probably use SMS in preference because it uses the least amount of network capacity. Use off-peak messages. Don't send messages when the network's going to be at its busiest. Don't violate local data protection rules. This includes, in many places, mobile numbers. You're not allowed to keep lists of mobile numbers. Minimize the overall number of messages. Ideally, cooperate with other agencies so that we don't send 28 messages telling people to wash their hands, and then the 29th message says, by the way, there's a hurricane coming tomorrow. Because by that time, no one will have paid attention. And don't send messages to non-active handsets. Following a disaster, there's a good chance that quite a large number of handsets won't be working properly. Maybe they don't have power or someone's forgotten them. If you send a message to that handset, it doesn't go away. It gets lodged in the network until the network can see that handset and then deliver it. And then that gradually stacks and stacks up until such time as the network goes, boom, falls over. So it's not a good idea to just do these SMS blasts to the entire population. So in Haiti, in conjunction with the mobile operator, we set out to see what we could do about answering some of these challenges. The system that we've got sends only to active handsets. It does this by listening to what's happening on the network. Part of the system plugs in to the mobile switch, that's the exchange, the telephone exchange, and it sees which handsets are actually being used. So who's making or receiving phone calls or making or sending text messages, and it lodges those, it records those, and it also makes a note of which mobile tower they're connected to. So this gives us a fix as to where those numbers are actually located. This means that we can send location-based messages. So if we've got a message which is only relevant to someone in a particular area, let's say that we're stopping water trucking service in one particular valley, we want to tell people that that's going to happen, we only need to send messages to that valley. We don't have to blast it to the entire country. We also have a throttling profile built into the system, which the operator controls. So this means the operator can control how many messages we send per hour at different times throughout the day. So he could be absolutely certain that we're not going to create some kind of congestion for him, which is an important point from his point of view. We have the facility to allow people to opt in and opt out. Again, this comes from experience. In Haiti, rather surprisingly, we found that a certain number of people complained about getting these messages. They complained about being told to wash their hands and how to recognize if someone had cholera and so on. And these were relatively wealthy people. Maybe they didn't want to be reminded that there was a disaster going on outside their front door. I don't know. But they complained. And you might think, well, what does that matter? Well, the reason it matters is that they complained to the mobile operator. And because they're wealthy people, they actually represented a very significant part of that mobile operator's business. So we had the marketing people within the operator complaining to the people that we were working with, saying, this is causing us a problem, it's damaging our business, can you stop them from sending these messages, please? So what we've done is, we've built in an opt-in, opt-out system, so that anyone who doesn't want to receive the messages anymore can just send an opt-out message back to the number that sent it to them. It's very easy. You can also opt in as well, so depending upon how local data protection rules work, it may be that we run a campaign in advance advising people of this service in the time of a disaster and inviting them to opt in. So there's a number of ways in which you can run it. We also offer the operator an ability to add their own blacklisting, so they can specifically exclude certain people from the service completely if they want to. And this is the most important thing, is that ultimately control lies with the operator. Other steps, use well-prepared and approved messaging well in advance, and we've been talking with Info as Aid to actually help prepare some messages well in advance of a disaster. And as I say here, seek coordinated messaging with other agencies so that we don't create spam and stop people from listening. Ideally, develop trust in the medium in advance of any disaster. So in other words, you should be there before so that people know what it is they're looking at or listening to. Think about alternative channels in the event of the main network going offline. So in our case in Kathmandu, what we're considering doing is having a separate messaging strategy for those people who are on the emergency network. Making sure that we have some community leaders who are equipped with phones in that case. And the other thing is to provide a full audit trail of messages to the operator, so the operator does know what you've been doing. So you're treating them with respect. So what we do in TERA, this is what the TERA screen looks like. This is Haiti. The operator simply draws a shape on the map, and TERA picks up the mobile phones which are registered in that area. Gives the operator a message which says, there's so many mobile phones, let's say 1,800 or whatever, that are in this area. You select the message that you want to send, and off it goes. It just goes to those people in that specific area. So what we ask the operator to do is to give us access to their network in advance of any disaster. This is probably the tricky bit. We're asking them to do something for us while there's not a clear and present disaster in operation, which requires a bit of persuasion. We ask them to provide a couple of pieces of hardware, two computers basically, and a piece of Oracle software, and then to work with our team to implement the system, which is about 25 man-days worth of effort for them. Altogether, this lot adds up to about $50,000. The guys that developed this have donated it to the IFRC for use, as long as it's used for humanitarian purposes. That's it. But that doesn't mean there's no cost associated with implementing it, because you need an Oracle license to run with it, and obviously you need some hardware to run it on, and you need to implement it. Part of the implementation is that we have to map the cell towers in the country to particular geographic locations, and that's what takes most of the time. I then go on to ask them to provide us with SMS messaging free of cost. The rationale for doing this is because we're using this at off-peak, it doesn't actually have any real cost to them to do this. And the basic argument that I use as to why operators should do this is, first of all, it's the right thing to do. And okay, maybe that doesn't sell that well everywhere within the operator. So the next thing I go on and say is, actually, these people we're talking about helping are your business. If they die, they're not going to make any phone calls, to put it bluntly. If they're impoverished as a result of a disaster, the number of phone calls they make is going to be reduced. So it's in your interest to help us to help them. That's the first thing. By working with us on this, you're giving them, your customers, another reason for using your network. It's a reason for them to be loyal. And it's another reason for your staff to be pleased about working for you. That you're not just a money-grubbing commercial exercise, you're actually showing some compassion here. And perhaps the real killer is, it's a very good return on investment for them. So if they spend $50,000, let's look at Haiti, for example. They spent $50,000 implementing this for us, and they gave us a large number of SMSs at no cost. But they were able to claim that they'd helped us with about $3 million worth of aid effort, which makes them look very good. So that basically is the argument for why they should help us. In the spirit of cooperation within CDAC, I'd be very glad to help you with any advice on how to approach mobile operators for whatever project it is that you've got in mind. Or if you're interested in cooperating with us in using the TERA as a method of sending messages, please also talk to me about that.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Robin. That was really interesting. And I think that brings us to the end, a little bit over time, but I think it was worth staying for it. I just want to end by thanking you all for coming. A quick plug for CDAC. If your organization is not a member of CDAC, I would strongly encourage you to consider becoming a member, and I hope today's event has just given a hint of why it might be a useful thing to be part of this organization, this network that is CDAC. So thank you very much, everybody, and hope to see you again.